Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Hongni, Ore, and Clay. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny, Zongjun,
Hey.
and Emily Huang.
Hello, hello.
Hello, everyone. Some background to my first question. The editorial team was surprised by the phrase, Hongni is weathered Baini. We've discussed the process of physical and chemical weathering in previous chapters. What was it about this statement that surprised you?
As we read through what Baini, Jiani, Nani, all of these were, I think mentally I had kind of blocked them off as unique rock structures, as unique ore, and didn't really think about their degradation over time or how they might morph into other materials. And then I think particularly maybe for Baini to Hongni, I had mentally seen Hongni as just these blocks of ore within the clay and within the different stratas. But maybe it's because of the coloration. I never really imagined, because seeing the fired color of Baini, right? It is white. There might have been something mentally there where I just could not imagine how something that is fired to be white could also be fired to be red, even though obviously iron content plays a huge role in that. But yeah, I think just that piece, the weathering, was something that didn't come to mind when I had actually thought about Hongni ore.
And this isn't a fast process. This is happening on a geological time scale. Zongjun, do you want to describe a little bit about this process where Baini turns into Hongni? This isn't something that you wake up one morning and look at your strata and say, wow, we got it, right? This is something that's happening on the order of thousands of years.
Yeah, just spray some magic water and some SCOBY and it will ferment into a Hongni eventually. No, that's not how it happened. It's mostly a cross effect of oxidation and also rainwater weathering the Baini structure. That's why oftentimes you would observe Hongni being a adjacent layer to some Baini or Yellowstone structure.
And through the chapter, I was reading that Hongni occurs underneath the Yellowstone layer. Zongjun, as you were talking about rain weathering, Jason, is that kind of a factor where as weathering is occurring, there's materials that are able to make it through that Yellowstone layer, some that are not. And is that a factor in the formation of Hongni ore?
Yes, that's exactly correct. So if you think about Yellowstone layer, it's a catalytic sandstone, and the material that's going to filter through the Yellowstone layer bed is going to be selective. It's permeable, but it is not inert. It's going to catch certain compounds. It's going to filter certain compounds. So you're going to get a migration predominantly of iron compounds and other silicates through the Yellowstone layer, deposited into the Baini, some of which it catches and holds, forming the Hongni ore. And so you'll see that there's still Baini strata scattered throughout Yixing. And so what you'll see is that not all Baini under Yellowstone layer turns into Hongni. It's only some of it that happen to have the right precipitate, that happen to have the right chemical weathering and the materials for chemical weathering to be transported via physical weathering in order for that transformation to take place. My next question. All red-colored Zisha clay from the Ming and Qing dynasty are blends of Zhuni and Hongni. Do you have a personal process in differentiating the dominant clay in the blend?
A lot of contemporary scholars nowadays start to clarify what exactly Hongni is. In the past, Hongni is really like umbrella, confusing, overarching term that refers to anything that looks red after firing. And what we know nowadays is a lot of the ores, like Zini or Hongni or Zhuni, when they are fired in certain temperatures, they could look red or orange red. So before the contemporary era, when you are talking about Hongni, you're really talking about a mixture of a lot of stuff that needs to have a clarification on the contemporary notion.
Well, we talk about that in the chapter on pinpei, on the historical art of blending, and that most of the historical wares were made from some types of blended ores. They didn't have the same focus on purity or pure ores that we do today. And so when we look at red clay, I think what you're saying is that it's very difficult to look at a historical ware and say, of course, this is a 30% Zhuni and 60% Hongni and 10% Shihuangni grains.
You're not able to do that, Jason? You can't just do that?
Off the cuff? Well, my process for determining what the composition of an antique ware is, you just smash it. Take one look at it, you smash and you examine the shards.
Send it in for, analytical testing. Yeah, that's the best way to do it.
No, so obviously, right, we need some kind of non-destructive intuition. in order to be able to do this. So the question is, in a complex matrix, do you have a process for doing this? Do you think that this is valuable, or do you believe that actual knowledge like that is impossible without some type of analytical work, preferably non-destructive analytical work?
Well, I prefer to cultivate my destructive intuition, but using my non-destructive intuition, I think when I'm looking at Zhuni versus Hongni or trying to determine, right, therefore, I think texture plays a big role in it for me. So from what I've seen and what I own, at least, of Hongni pots, Hongni often ends up being much smoother than a lot of Zhuni. Both contemporary and historical Zhuni, which obviously is containing some Hongni, tends to have some pretty distinct textures, wrinkling texture, pear skin texture, sometimes bumpy texture that can be seen to a degree in Hongni, but I think it's always emphasized more in Zhuni. And so that's one place that I'll look. I think color is a dangerous road to go down, but at least from the experiences that I've had in the teapots I've handled, I do have somewhat of a mental model of the color range of Zhuni versus Hongni, and there's a lot of overlap, so it's probably not the most useful tool. But then from there, I think brewing. So I do think that I have an understanding of some slight differences in effect between Zhuni and Hongni. If you give me modern of one and antique of the other, could get a little muddled, but at least contemporary for both, I could probably tell you from brewing it and the effect it has on the tea what I think it would be. But you don't always get that chance, right, when you're trying to buy a ware, getting to really brew with it. So I think texture is probably going to be my big one. Definitely curious what everyone else's tools are to try and determine between the two.
Yeah, I think those are pretty good matrix to make decisions. One thing that I would also notice is the shining sparkles on the surface, which are usually the mica. Hongni has usually far less mica than Zhuni or blends with other types of clay. So if I see a Hongni or a red teapot with significantly less mica but has a very good texture and the color, I would say it's probably more leaning on the pure Hongni side of the matrix.
The primary indicator in my mind is usually the texture, the formation of pear skin or various waves, bumps, lumps. That is usually indicative of a higher content Zhuni ware in my mind. That's not perfect. It's possible to make a very shiny, smooth Zhuni, but that tends to be much more modern, contemporary than the traditional texture you expect from a Zhuni ware. Is there an advantage to blended Zhuni and Hongni? Why don't we see many blended Zhuni and Hongni wares today?
From being a consumer, what I see is Zhuni generally seems like it's selling for more money. So if I was going to be a producer and I had both ores, I'd probably try and maximize the value that I can get out of both of them. Sell my Zhuni for as much as possible, sell my Hongni for as much as possible, instead of blending and potentially seeing my Zhuni price dip a little bit because it's blended with Hongni or vice versa. So that's probably one reason why. I think from a performance standpoint, we do have a lot of good antique pots that show that blended Zhuni with some Hongni performs well. So I wouldn't be surprised if you still have some contemporary artists who are playing around with that blend.
I've never personally used a ware that has a blend with Hongni and Zhuni, so I can't really make a judgment on the performance. That would be an interesting experiment to try. Maybe for our next commission, we can try to replicate a traditional recipe of a clay blend and test the effect.
Oh, that would be fun. We go 30-70 and then we go 50-50 and then 70-30. That could be very, very interesting, and look at the 3 different time points of the approximate historical ratios.
Yeah.
So, Zongjun, how much money are you trying to spend this year on Yixings, man? Just keep coming up with these ideas.
That sounds like a lot of money, because following up to Jason's question about why they would start the blend in the first place and why we don't have a lot of blends nowadays, one big part of it, I think, would be the ore is rare. It's very hard to find Zhuni. So I think one of the reasons they started blending was also because if you make a pot with 100% that ore, it would be very pricey, and blending it just let you pace yourself throughout your supply. And then now, again, same reason, more difficult, rare to mine, all that. And the technique itself of blending is very difficult. So it requires a lot of art and experience to master.
Rarity was certainly a factor during the F1 period. They had begun to ration the clay because of different shortages, and it actually spurred some innovation in creating substitute clays.
Correct me if I'm wrong, that the discovery of Hongni was also because they had a shortage. They started to realize that they are experiencing a shortage in Zini.
I wouldn't say that discovery was driven by that. The separation between Zhuni and Hongni happened later, and so there wasn't really an idea of that. The mining regions continuously expanded throughout the Ming until the mining was banned at the end of the F1 period in 1992 or so.
I see.
Mine goes down a slightly different route. We're talking about the blends of Zhuni and Hongni. And Jason, you go on to write in this chapter why they are, from a geological standpoint, categorically separate ores. I'm really interested, since these are coming from different mines or different strata within different mines. How do you think people decided to start blending them when they're coming from pretty different sources to begin with? This wasn't a paragenensis or something, right, where they just saw it together and decided to use it together.
That's totally correct. They came from different mines. My most likely explanation, which I do believe to be correct, is that they ran firing tests. So they looked at the colors that they fired, and the Zhuni would frequently break. And so by blending two red firing ores, they were able to get a more consistent reduced breakage rate and actually produce wares that were usable. I think it was a very utilitarian explanation that they needed to come up with blends that didn't crack in the dragon kiln or crack at first use.
Yeah, so not only just blends with Hongni and Zhuni, later on you will see blends with all the other red color materials too, like a Shihong and some gradient Shihuang, and even blending those with Zini to sometimes increase the saturation of the color.
And another point that goes back to the high breakage rate is we know even in antique wares, they would take previously fired Zhuni and re-mill it and use the cooked clay,
the grains,
in order to stabilize the wares for next firing.
Yeah, they call grok.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Chinese word cooked clay, shoucha.
Yeah, shoucha, cooked grain.
As we've been discussing, I want to talk a little bit about the confusion in naming. So Hongni at various times referred to all red colors as a clay, referred to a blend of Zhuni and Hongni or Hongni and Zini, and its subcategories also bear confusing names. Hong Qingshuini to, is there a reason why Hongni in particular has such a confusing naming scheme?
So confusing. Even for a native Chinese speaker, it was hard to follow at first. The different types of pony where they were categorized, that they used to mistakenly be one, and then they were actually different ores. I think it has a lot to do with the color that after they fired and probably the content of iron inside. So before actually having more knowledge of the different gradients and the different chemical compositions in these ores, it would probably just be commonly called Hongni because of the relatively more red color that it is. But then after more knowledge, understanding of the geography, the chemical compositions, etc., then people get to know a little bit more.
Yeah, I would agree on the point that the iron oxidate being such a ubiquitous content in a lot of clay type, that a lot of these clay ores, whether or not it's Duani, Zini, Hongni, or Zhuni, after they get fired, in some temperature range, they all appear red. It's like when we are drinking tea, we talk about oolong cha, but oolong is such a wide oxidation range from 10% all the way to 90% that a lot of these tea can be called oolong, but there's a very distinct differentiation between like Taiwanese Gaoshan oolong versus a yan cha from Wuyi.
In the beginning of this book and in our previous book, we talk about how different centers of knowledge may come up with different terminology for these items. So it's likely that the miners had their own name for these ores. The craftsmen bought it, purchased it, and kind of had their own terminology for certain ores. And then probably the collectors, users, right, the intelligentsia, literati, also probably then categorized further and further and further. And I think because the red color, as Zongjun and Emily definitely hit upon, just appears so much, there probably was so many names that involve red that it kind of makes sense that there would become an umbrella category using that name, even if it wasn't correct to a specific ore classification.
Totally agree. There's definitely a knowledge discrepancy between the miner and the ceramic artists and also the collectors, because there's also a color changing process between the ore and after the ore gets fired or gets processed. So frequently people will call something Hongni because it appears red as an ore, but after it gets fired, voila, it turns into a darker color or even sometimes a paler color. So depending on who you ask, really, you frequently end up getting different names for the same type of ore or clay.
So Hongni is more confusing. It is particularly confusing, I should say, because the name refers to the color after it's fired, whereas most of the other ores refer to the name before it's fired.
Just in case some of our listeners don't know, Hong is red in Chinese, and Zhu is also another color of red in Chinese. So when we say Hongni and Zhuni, that is why it's even more confusing. Not to mention there is Xiaohongni and Dahongpao, which if you just read it, it could be super confusing.
Speaking of, most Hongni wares are simply labeled as Hongni when you go to a merchant to purchase a teapot, or they're given very aggrandizing names, such as the Hongni, the Hongpao. Why are the subcategories and variations of Hongni so much less known than Zini? Why don't we see more distinction within these subvariations, particularly at the merchant level when going to purchase Hongni wares?
Is it possible the merchants don't know from what ore that their pots were fired from?
Maybe they know and they just say it's part of Zini because Zini has already a good consumer base, shopper base, and a good awareness level to it.
Do you mean Zhuni? I think it'd be a little difficult to pass off Hongni wares as a Zini. Zhuni is plausible.
And maybe also the same rationale behind the blends.
Zongjun, you don't agree? You think that the merchants do label that you could go and buy a specific Hongni ware? Or do you think that there's not enough percolation in consumer knowledge to bother making the differentiations beyond grandizing names?
I think it's a mixture of the latter and also just generally less consumer recognition on Hongni. And I would really raise my eyebrow when I walk into a shop and see a Hongni teapot marked as Da Hongpao on the shelf with a very high price tag. It's usually quite suspicious. Being a super rare clay to begin with, it's like calling your best teapot in your tea shop traditional ancient Tianqing. I think that consumers are not willing probably to pay a much higher price for Hongni to begin with. And with all these notions, it's harder to educate the market to pay a higher price.
This chapter mentions the color changing effect, where a Yixing teapot changes color when heated with boiling water. Have you personally experienced a color changing teapot, and should such a color changing effect be considered desirable?
诸色变色.
I've seen videos of the color changing effect. I have not experienced using a pot myself that had that.
Me neither.
I have seen wares that change color after usage, but on the scene, I don't think I've seen that before. Have you, Jason?
I think I accidentally purchased a ware that exhibits a very minor amount of color changing effect. It's a ROC Tiaosha Zini, but when pouring boiling water over it, it brightens and turns a brighter shade of red, which I was quite surprised at because it was not mentioned in the negotiation on that teapot.
Maybe they never tried brewing tea with it.
Yeah, it's possible.
Is it a bug or a feature? Maybe I should not tell.
It's a good question. Is it a bug or a feature? In a contemporary pot, I would be very concerned. In a contemporary teapot, I would think that this has been doped or dosed with some artificial colorant that changes color. And we've seen that in Yixing. We've seen those little statues or chatongs that change color very vibrantly. So it wasn't mentioned. The teapot dates to its claim. It is ROC. But it's the only one I've ever used, and I have no idea whether or not it represents any type of improvement in the utility of the teapot or its interaction with tea.
Good party trick, though.
Yeah, it's certainly fancy and beautiful. That's why it got recorded in the Yangxian Shahu Tukao.
Okay, so let's mark that as one of the many experiments. We all need to buy a antique color change teapot and see if it performs well.
As long as you'll find them for us, we'll buy them.
As long as I don't have to pay for all of them. My last question. Hongni forms a few interesting distinct subtypes, such as Hong Qingshuini, a blend of Hongni and Qing Shui Ni Zini, which was popular in Taiwan during the F1 period, and Shihuangni, a natural mix of Hongni and degraded sandstone. What is special or unique about these materials?
At least what I understand from the chapter is that some of these were, at least at some point, natural blends that were occurring near each other and most likely were just kind of mined together and processed together. So you kind of got a unique and specific blend, but I think over time that changed. So I think one of the original points, at least for some of those named blends, something that was unique was that they were kind of naturally occurring together. Nian Gaotu is the only one that I've actually seen and actually had opportunities to purchase and was happy I did not. So I haven't seen Shihuangni in real life. I have seen Shihuang when we went to Yixing, but the Nian Gaotu, I know at least from what I've seen, was a real dense clay. And I think the versions that I saw were the post 1982. And Jason, I had sent you a link saying, hey, how does this look? And you're like, don't buy, do not buy.
That sounds right.
Although it's from a legendary place and era, it's one of the first experiments of adding artificial colorants and oxidates into the clay. The effect on the tea, I think it's debatable, but certainly not of a natural blend.
I have also never seen Shihuangni, and I don't know if I would immediately recognize it if presented with something that's obviously Hongni with the integrated degraded Yellowstone layer sandstone. Without having seen it before, I don't really know how unique or different or differentiated it is from other Hongnis. That's one that we should track down.
We'll get a couple coasters made out of it before we get a few teapots.
So we can play, feel, and understand the clay before determining if it's worthwhile to put into teapot form. Well, thank you, everyone. That is all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Zhuni ore and clay.